As one grows older, one suffers more. By the time one is very old, one is fed up with life. I don't think any old person who is really old and who has suffered would want to go on in this life. Because old age is not something that one wants to last forever. Old age is not something that one would want to last forever. It is not a pleasant thing to be very old. It is life at its most difficult stage. I think it is the worst of life, without question. It is the worst side of life, the worst part of life. Therefore, when death comes to the old, they will welcome it. At least they should welcome it. It is a merciful end to the great suffering that life is. Life is great suffering. We don't realize that at first. When we are children, we may not realize the great suffering that life is. But slowly, as we grow older, we realize that it is not easy. Right now, in the middle of life, I find it difficult. In fact, there are times when I look forward to being taken away from this life into this other world that God has spoken of. Sometimes I want to leave this world and its pain. But I know I have to be here until God calls me. That's the only way to leave. That's the only honorable way to leave. But we will all leave someday, and this is the way God has planned it. We will leave this world someday. This suffering is not endless. This is the merciful act of God. Some of you may say, what is the point of all this suffering? How could a merciful God allow us to suffer? How can a merciful God want us to suffer? To answer that, one must look at suffering and see whether it has any merit. Does suffering have merit? Does suffering do anything good? Does suffering only bring tears? Does suffering bring only pain? Does suffering add nothing to a person? Does suffering only subtract from a person? I think suffering ultimately does something good. Suffering reminds us of what we miss, of what we are missing in our lives. And what we are missing in our lives is the health of God, is the perfect health, the perfect joy, the perfect peace of God. There is something called perfection. There is a perfect life somewhere. And that is what is missing in our lives. And suffering makes us aware of it. It makes us aware of what is missing, so that we may long for that which is missing. So, if we understand that suffering is not necessarily bad, that it leads us to a certain yearning, that it stirs within us a certain yearning for perfection, then we will welcome life, we will welcome the worst of life, we will welcome even old age, because suffering increases our desire for God, who alone can give us a life where there is no suffering. There is such a life awaiting us, awaiting each and every one of us who trusts in the truth of God, which is not necessarily an observable fact, but it can be felt, it can be known in a very deep place, in a man's heart, in the spiritual center of his consciousness.